So maybe as a place to begin the conversation, we can just talk a little bit about your career and what it is that you do now and what your kind of particular areas of academic interest are and things you like to write about. Just a little background on what makes you you.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm a
Yeah.
political scientist. I'm a professor in the political science department at Vanderbilt University. And my research is focused on what we call political behavior, which is basically the study of ordinary citizens. And that includes topics in public opinion, campaigns and elections, things
Hmm.
like that.
And you are also involved in a publication called Good Authority, which used to be the Monkey Cage. Maybe talk a bit about what that publication is all about and how it has evolved over time. I know it's been around for about a
Sure.
year now.
Yeah. So the Monkey Cage got its start in 2007
Hmm.
in the golden age of blogging, and
Yes.
there was at that point in time there weren't a lot of general interest political science blogs. I think the academic community that was the most engaged in blogging was economics, and um, a couple of other political scientists and I started the Monkey Cage to have an opportunity to talk about interesting research and correct people's misunderstandings of politics and argue with columnists and reporters from time to time. And yeah, and that the Monkey Cage went for quite a long time,
Hmm.
including some years where we were publishing with the Washington Post.
Right.
Um, and when that relationship ended, we launched the sort of a successor, really, but very much the same mission called Good Authority as an independent site just over a year ago.
Hmm.
So the goal of Good Authority is no different. It's a group of political scientists writing about their areas of expertise and trying to use a researched informed analysis to provide some insights and stuff that you wouldn't necessarily get just by reading news coverage of politics or by reading the kinds of political analysts and writers that are on the op-ed pages of newspapers and places like that.
Yeah, it's an interesting project. I was recently at a symposium, I suppose, put on at the CUNY, the Craig Newmark School of Journalism here, and so it was remarkable for a couple of reasons. It was an excellent panel. Almost everyone were, I think they all, in fact, were op-ed columnists, which is not to say that they don't do reporting, but they had some interesting reflections on kind of the role of reporting in candidly the title of the event was "Is It Our Fault?" um, and they were trying to sort of grapple with the challenges of um, covering candidates who don't tell the truth, covering extreme politics, covering authoritarianism, and that sort of thing. But one of the interesting kind of comments from one of the panelists was, am I even the right person to be asking this question? Should I have a political scientist or an anthropologist or some other social scientist asking these questions? And I did find myself thinking, yes, I don't recall those being required courses for my journalism degree. I do recall having to take Econ 101 and 102.
Well, and
So,
to be fair to journalists, like a lot of what political scientists know and do is locked up in paywalled journals, and
mhm.
it's written in a language that's basically like internal to our discipline and not necessarily comprehensible to people outside the discipline. And so
Yeah.
one of the reasons we started the Monkey Cage and continue on with Good Authority is as much to help political scientists translate their understanding for a broader audience. So I definitely think that it's always potentially valuable to have that knowledge,
Hmm.
at your fingertips if you need it. I'm not suggesting political science is useful for everything that journalists care about, but it's up to but the onus is not just on the journalists. It's on scholars to try to find ways to communicate.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I want to talk to you today is a piece that is behind one of these academic paywalls. But I wanted to start with this sort of thread that has emerged throughout this particular polling and election cycle about, and it's, a perennial topic is how do we understand young voters and the youth vote for sure. There has been quite a bit made over the last couple of cycles about a sort of leftward drift of 18 to 34-year-old voters, and that they kind of seem to be starting out from slightly more liberal positions cycle after cycle. I'll say as a brand marketer, I sometimes think, is that really about like their political orientations, or is that a reaction to the party brands? And it's a good question, I suppose. But one of the things that has emerged this cycle is a lot of people have spoken about the idea that the Republican ticket is really aiming itself at men in general, and that some of their media choices have been specifically focused on young men through things like podcasts and YouTube streamers and TikTok and those kinds of things, Twitch. But that has also turned into a polling narrative where we have some polls suggesting that there is a wide gap between young men and young women in terms of their political alignments. Others that show a small gap, a gap that looks like every other age cohort's gender gap. And I wanted to talk to you about that because it feels like the story has kind of congealed at this point, that young men are much more conservative than young women. And so maybe you start by kind of talking about what piqued your interest in that narrative, and what, because you wrote a piece about this, and that's how we got in touch, was I found that.
Yeah, sure. I think this issue has been brewing for some months now, and certainly the 2024 campaign is bringing renewed attention to it. And I guess I start just in terms of my own so my beliefs going into the topic, right, are that, well, first of all, gender gaps in public opinion and political behavior have been present on some issues for a long time. Mm-hmm. And there's been a gender gap in presidential voting that mostly is the result of men being somewhat more Republican than they were in the 1950s and 60s. Mm-hmm. And women have not changed in the same way. So all of that's true. At the same time, when we're thinking about like what we see in popular coverage of politics, the other thing I observe is that no one writes stories when there's not a gender gap, right? There's only stories when there is a gender gap, right? And so I'm conscious that what gets selected for attention and then becomes, as you say, crystallized or congealed into a narrative is often the splashiest finding, or of the 58 questions on the survey, it's the 4 questions where there was a meaningful gender gap. This gets, I think, the challenge of portraying this accurately is compounded when you are focused not just on men and women and the population as a whole, but on men and women in particular subgroups, like among young people defined as whatever, but usually like 18 to 29-year-olds. So now you're looking at a group of people that's a small subset of any particular national survey. And just there's a lot more uncertainty that enters into our ability as researchers to identify the political attitudes of smaller subgroups relative to just identifying political attitudes of national samples as a whole. So what happened in the particular case that you're referring to is there's a set of surveys conducted by the New York Times and Siena College in battleground states that are the basis of their political polling and news coverage of the campaign. And those surveys, when they combined the battleground surveys together, showed like a big difference between younger men and younger women. Younger men were, a Trump-leaning group. There were basically no differences among men based on their age group at all. But young women were very much leaning towards supporting Harris over Trump, and they were much more liberal than any group, including most other groups of women. So it was a really, striking graph. Well, I just opened up 2 other surveys, that I happened to have, and those results look different. Those results look like you've got a modest sized gender gap in every age group. young men and young women are more Harris-centered than Trump-centered. Young men look more liberal in this sense than older men and even older women. So what story is right? And the answer is we don't know. And my goal in this was really to introduce uncertainty into the conversation. So to uncongeal the narrative, not because I happen to think that the New York Times Siena polls are wrong. I have no way of knowing at this point. And we might, after the election, get a better sense of this, although even after the election, different polling and survey projects don't always tell us exactly the same story about how different groups of Americans vote. So yeah, I think my takeaways from this particular little online, back and forth is really, first of all, just be very careful when you see news stories about gender gaps in terms of what's not being reported. And then if you're really deeply interested in like what are the politics of young men and young women or any subgroup of the American public, just realize that like it's harder to get like the quote unquote true estimate of those people's opinions. And I think paying attention to variation across surveys is useful in terms of calibrating like how much uncertainty you should have.
I think this is an interesting challenge for people reporting on polling. And I'll kind of break it into two parts. I think one is you see an interesting finding that seems a little bit extreme, and I don't mean like politically extreme. I just mean like stark differences. And then checking to see if anybody else has, got similar results. And I think that it could be an easy temptation to say, well, there's this one study that shows this result and two or three others that show some other kind of result. And they're more like each other than they are like this one. So majority rules. And these are therefore obviously the right ones. But to your point, it's kind of unknowable at this point, certainly where they are. We might know, and we'll get to the conversation about the different approaches to figuring out how people voted after the fact. But it seems like a perennial challenge in reporting on survey data anyway, but also a particular challenge in election years where the kind of more exciting story gets more breadth, and there isn't necessarily a kind of follow-up of like, well, we went and looked, except for pieces like yours on good authority. And so I wonder about, sitting as you do as a political scientist, what would be a better way of sort of talking about these things for people who are reporting on polls where it's like, well, we got this really interesting result. We've had other results that don't quite match up on it. Maybe there's something happening here. Maybe there isn't. I think instead it seems like it's just, at least in some punditry circles, taken as read that Trump is performing better with young men than obviously than with young women, but certainly much better than expected. And some even kind of going so far as to say he's winning young men, which seems to vary a lot from survey to survey. But how do you go about thinking about that? I think the easy thing to do would be to look at your piece and go, well, 2 out of 3 say that it's not a problem.
Yeah, this is a really challenging issue, in part because I don't necessarily think that majority rules in this case. Like, I don't know for a fact that the 2 surveys that I analyzed that showed a more modest gender gap are the right answer, and surveys that show a larger gender gap are the wrong answer. So obviously with polling generally, in elections, we often talk about averaging polls in order to get something that's not as sensitive to the particular idiosyncrasies of any one poll. And people have started doing that for subgroups within polls too. There's people that are providing very handy cross-tab averages. Adam Carlson, if you look him up on Twitter, is one. I've known him a long time, and I think that's such a service. So I would start with that. I guess I think there needs just to be kind of a mentality of embracing the complexity as opposed to sort of embracing a narrative that is obviously a better story, no question, but may not be the most like reliable at the end of the day. And so embracing the complexity really means I mean, I don't know, you may not even have the word count to do it, right? Like diving deeper, asking people, including pollsters who, are doing the surveys or other people, like why are the results different? You
Mm-hmm.
know, how can we explain this, or is this just just randomness, and there's no way to know for sure. Um, this, you could say the same thing about surveying, different racial and ethnic groups. Same
Mm-hmm.
issues arise. Like, how do we know that this is a very good sample of
Mm-hmm.
white Americans or Black Americans or Asian Americans or whomever? So that'd be one way to sort of think about it. I think the other, I guess the other question would be to try to take the broadest possible look at different kinds of survey questions that would give us a sense of whether a particular subgroup is more liberal or more conservative. So, like I mentioned, don't look at 4 questions, not the other 58 questions earlier. Like you should, so like really try to unpack, like, where do we see like gender gaps and why?
Mm-hmm.
Where do we not? Like, what does that tell us about the politics of these folks? I think it's also really important to make like comparisons across, like, as many comparisons as possible. So I'm always happy to see a survey only of 18 and 29-year-olds, because that probably means it's a larger sample and maybe they've taken more effort to weight that sample to the actual characteristics of the 18 by 29-year-old population in the country as a whole. But on the other hand, I also wonder, well, if what's true for 18 and 29-year-olds is also true for every other age group that was not surveyed, we don't really know what to make of what's going on with young people. So as many comparisons as possible, I think, is really helpful. So in the case of looking at young men and young women, you always want to have comparisons to older groups of men and women.
Yeah.
In everything that you do. So social scientists are always asking the question, compared to what? So, like,
right.
Is there a gender gap on this question, but compared to what? Compared to other questions? Compared to what happened in 2020? Compared to other age groups? How do we understand that? So I think that means, I think that makes for a frustrating experience a lot of times, especially for reporters who are on deadline and have to write 800 words. But to me, it's analogous to the I guess, like, saying that, don't report on studies, report on literatures. Like, I think reporters and others who do science communication have now figured out that, like, although any individual study can be right, there's often a risk where one study's answer, even if it's very, like, eye-catching,
right,
is an outlier. And we need to understand the broader literature to figure out what makes sense. And so expanding the scope of evidence is always going to be a valuable thing. And then when we see outlying studies, like, it doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that we have to sort of think about them in the context of what other people have found. And maybe that gives us a little more uncertainty about what the truth is. But by embracing that particular kind of complexity, we'll get closer to the, a reliable answer, or at least an answer that, like, we can communicate to readers and listeners in a way that we can feel confident it's not going to end up, like, actively misleading them.
Right. Well, and I think, there's a couple of things in there. One is, we're taking a break at the moment, but I had been doing this other show more aimed at people who work in branding and marketing, because of the prevalence and ease of cutting survey data by age breaks and then labeling those age breaks as generations, and then being able to say millennials do this or that or the other thing. And we both have a strong allergy to that approach to talking about audiences, because, whatever, 80 million people worldwide is not a segment for marketing purposes. But it is a real tendency, even on the marketing side, to do a lot of, millennials are more likely to do X. Okay, more likely than who, more likely than when, more likely than what? Like, what is that comparator is actually extremely important when we're talking, especially when we're using this language of more likely. And so I think that's just like that should be a relatively easy to implement thing to against what comparison. And even if it's just one other thing, that would be good. But the other thing that seems to be very challenging, and it certainly is in my business as well, is just sampling young people. Getting young people to take surveys is extremely challenging. And so I could also imagine, maybe not in the youth only surveys, but in a national study that has 1,000 to 1,500, respondents in it. And, you're lucky if you're getting 150 people in the 18 to 29 category to answer that question, at which point there just is like a basic reality, which is no matter how representative that sample is, it's not representative because it's only 150 people out of tens of millions. And so what has your experience, what do you think accounts for that? What is happening with, and it's been happening for 30 years, but younger voters being less likely to respond to polls, being smaller subsets of the overall sample. And this will also edge us into another question I have about how we even know who we should be sampling for a representative sample of the electorate. But let's just start with the problem of youth voters, maybe.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you allude to the longer term trend in declining response rates, which is largely a function of people not even they're not even able to reach them. So these are not people that like pick up their phone and then hang up on you because they don't want to take your poll. It's just that people don't answer. So I think the challenge is that for younger people, a couple things are true. One is that obviously cell phones are their only, medium of communication. Landlines are obviously out for them as well as for lots of other older adults as well. There's no norm of using the phone as a device for calling people, right? Like it's not the norm of, what they typically do. And so the idea that you pick up your phone and answer calls from unknown numbers is just, I don't do that either, but it's very hard to imagine they want to do that. So your options for reaching young people, either, you're going to try to find them online and enlist them in surveys. You can recruit them, by the same way you recruit adults to these online surveys, which is by sending them letters and trying to get them via mail to join a panel or to respond to a QR code on the letter that you sent them, or type in this, URL into a browser and answer the survey that way. Of course, the challenge is young people are not easy to reach by mail. So then you're left with are we texting them? And that's where I think a lot of the exploration is ongoing in terms of, can we use different modes of contact to get to different populations? And is there a way to find young people more readily if we're not relying on, things that for them might as well be like passenger carrier pigeons, right? Like we need, something like a text is going to feel more their vernacular than will a certified letter in the mail or God forbid a phone call.
Right.
So, I think this, but and again, this is not just unique to young people. There are other subgroups of the population that are also hard to survey that you have to try to experiment with mode of contact to try to get them. And that's where I think what surveyors are constantly trying to figure out. I'm not a pollster. I don't have to live and die by this, thank goodness. So I have nothing but respect for that kind of work. That strikes me as I think something that everyone's trying to figure out.
Yeah. It's particularly, of interest to me. We have had a few projects where, we've been trying to figure out how to sample, for instance, just people who would be less likely to have broadband internet. And one of the providers we've talked to about those projects is a specialist in this area. And you will not find their office in the collar counties of Philadelphia, or out in Edison, New Jersey or something like that, which is where a lot of the particularly qualitative sample providers are. And they will literally go to people's homes and bring an iPad and take them through the survey. And then they collect everything on the iPad. But it's much more old fashioned. It's like going door to door with a clipboard, and it's just very interesting to think about challenges like that. And then obviously you have people living in reservations as well, where they may not have specific addresses. They have a PO box and a location on the res, and like same kind of thing applies. And you do have sort of specialists there. It works for qualitative sample sizes, but when you're trying to figure out what a representative sample is and do it at scale, I think it's clearly very challenging. The other thing that seems to be challenging about it is this question of who do we think the electorate is going to be? And therefore, how representative do we need to be of the general population? The general population rake doesn't look the same necessarily as the likely voter, or the who's going to vote this year, whether they're likely or not, kind of frame. I think it has been interesting to notice a subtle shift in how New York Times Siena has been posting their crosstabs, which is, instead of having the registered voter, likely voter crosstabs, they now seem to have gone to mostly doing likely electorate crosstabs, which I have noticed people on election Twitter getting a little wrapped around the axle about, because they want to know why people who say they're not all that likely to vote are in the likely electorate sample. And obviously one of the reasons for this, guys, is there's always a group of people that are not likely to vote who vote. So how do you represent them, and what do they even look like, becomes an interesting challenge. This seems to me to be one of the biggest problems of just thinking about electorates, which is, in a place where it's not compulsory, in a place where participation rate first is driven by whether you're even registered or not, how do we start to imagine who voters are? And I'm curious, how you think about that problem.
Yeah, so there's sort of two different ways of thinking about this. One is to say the likely electorate we should try to measure that group based on what they have actually done in the last several elections, and that's we're going to use your actual report card to know if you're a reliable voter or not. And the other way of doing it is to say we'll just take what you say your plan is at face value, and if you say you're definitely going to vote, we'll just assume that you're going to vote. So the first strategy is made possible now by the ability of pollsters to build samples off the state voter files. And so state voter files, which are pretty much public information, tell us, for any particular voter, John Sides in Nashville, Tennessee, did he vote in these last several elections? As long as I've been a registered voter in this city, or county. So if you're building a sample off your voter file, you have that information, and then you have the survey response that they also told you when you interviewed them, which is, am I definitely likely to vote or somewhat likely to vote or whatever. So usually I think if pollsters have both kinds of information, they're using both to come up with a sense of what makes sense. And the advantage of it is that you have the ability to look and see in the last election cycle, who did vote, right? And so you can see what strategy of identifying voters worked in that cycle. You get to see it after the election's over, whether they voted or not. So you get to see the end result. It's great. So this is I think what are called likely voter screens have gotten more sophisticated than they were when we just relied on random digit dialing surveys that were never linked to the voter file or other information. The challenge, though, and every pollster knows this, so this is not anything I'm telling them, is that obviously, if you have a way of modeling a likely electorate that you employed in the last cycle and learned from, you can employ it in this cycle, but you don't know if this year is going to be the same as the last cycle. And so it's the same issue with weighting samples to the population. How should you weight them? What should you weight on? How should we do that? You think, we failed in 2016 because we didn't capture that less educated voters, particularly white voters, were going to break for Trump. So if we weight the sample based on education, That'll ensure that we don't have polling errors like we did in 2016. So surveys started waiting on education in 2020, but if anything, got worse.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're constantly kind of fighting the last battle, or you're
Mm-hmm.
making decisions on the basis of like what you've learned in the last cycle. And it's hard to know whether that will apply in this cycle as well.
Yeah.
So, and again, like this wouldn't make a difference really, or a consequential difference if we were modeling like a typical uncompetitive House race, or even some Senate races where, the winner is going to get like 60% of the vote.
Mm-hmm.
But, when you're trying to get an electorate where you think the outcome is going to be decided by 3 points or less,
Right.
That's where, again, like it's very, very difficult to know that you're getting the right likely electorate that's going to enable you to call a race correctly when the margin of error, meaning your margin of error in terms of getting the race wrong,
Mm-hmm.
is so small.
Yeah.
So that's why I think, it's a very, to me, it's a very reasonable situation when pollsters make, I think, smart decisions with the best data they have. And if that decision doesn't pan out and they haven't modeled the right electorate, I mean, it's not exactly like you wouldn't be able to predict that in advance.
Right. I mean, this I think is where the kind of confusion comes in for people who are not, maybe I don't actually want to go as far as just sort of say like people are bad at probabilities or they're enumerate or whatever. I think it's like a conceptual problem to understand what a pollster is actually trying to do. And here I am thinking more about like sort of public pollsters as opposed to academics, but the job is sort of, because it is so anchored fundamentally in prediction. I talked to W. Joseph Campbell at American University, who wrote Lost in a Gallup last week. And great book, great little history. You get to really get the colorful characters of George Gallup and Elmo Roper and all of those guys. But like this is a kind of long-standing tension of the polls are here to predict the outcome because that's got good news value. And yet, frankly, frequently get the call wrong. Like if you go through the book, it's basically every other presidential election cycle. It's wrong this direction, that direction, or it's wrong because they tried to say it was a tie when it wasn't a tie, right? So there's a long history of this. The tension seems to exist where the pollsters want to have it as we're not making a prediction. This is a snapshot in time. Look at the averages. The forecasts are just forecasts. We're in fact, showing you these forecasts to express uncertainty. And, I talked to Mike Fedorza about this. Like, you shouldn't be expressing uncertainty to a decimal place. Nate Silver, you are sending a mixed message here in some of the presentations of this data where news junkies, poll junkies who nevertheless are not very sophisticated about polling will look at these things and see them as predictions, see them as portraying some type of certainty, and will be judging the quality of the polling on how right they were in the end. And then this other sort of conceptual challenge, which is that pollsters are actually doing something that I don't know that normal people realize they're doing, which is I think they think they're just like asking 1,500 people what they're going to do. But actually what they're trying to do is guess what the electorate is going to do and find a sample that is representative of that and ask them what they're going to do, which is this weird, like, I don't know, reverse engineer. It's reverse engineering a future state, which is like kind of mind blowing that anyone wants to do that. But I also don't gamble, so that's my personal, that's like my personality trait coming out here. But this question of communicating uncertainty, which is something that at the beginning of the conversation you said was sort of a goal of some of the writing that you do, and the goal of having social scientists write about their work in a more kind of accessible way, seems to be once again a thing that we're like circling the conversation, and everyone keeps telling the reader of the New York Times to embrace uncertainty, the follower of election Twitter to embrace uncertainty. but not actually giving them the tools to do so, and kind of simultaneously not actually communicating uncertainty, communicating quite a bit of specificity, which isn't certainty, but it looks like it, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree that there's a real tension here, and it's a tension that's driven in part by, the average news consumer,
Mm-hmm.
including sometimes me for that matter, who wants an answer,
Mm-hmm.
who wants to put a number on it, and by doing so, you're potentially sort of ignoring the uncertainty or shrinking the uncertainty too much. I think we've made progress here in the following sense. I mean, we've gone from just, we now for the last several election cycles have had polling averages. That obviously is helpful. Those averages also come with substantial uncertainty, because even an average of polls, obviously, it doesn't, is not some truth that,
Mm-hmm.
for which we can just believe in. The quantitative forecasts, whether that's what Nate Silver does or, other forecasters do, adds additional uncertainty into it, because then it's trying to map like the polls as of today and whatever other indicators to what's going to be true in several weeks when the election is held. And of course, there's the uncertainty of that forecast then is built into it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also pretty valuable, because like I personally think it's helpful to know that if Kamala Harris has a 3-point lead in the national polls plus X point lead on average in all of these other key battleground states, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
She has a 55% chance of winning.
Right.
I like that. I think that's very useful information. I agree. You don't want to be like false precision is a problem. You don't want to say 55.6.3. You don't want to have
let's not do the decimal points. Yeah.
Decimal points. But again, like just 55%. And you could be even more careful and be like, that's basically 50%. If you want to be very like hedging against being wrong. I think that's a very valuable thing to be able to do it that way. The challenge, I think, is that, first of all, it's making people like understand what that number means. And that's not so much a problem of the model. It's just a problem of the communication of the results.
Yeah.
And, 538 in the last cycle experimented with this. I've seen other scholars like do studies where if we represent probability this way versus this way, do people learn from it? Do people need to see, like 100 dots where 55 are colored blue and 45 are colored red to know that like that's what a 55% chance means if you pick one dot at random? What is it that people need to see? I think it's hard for some to convey that. But it, again, like that's not because forecasts are wrong or bad. It's just because uncertainty is hard to convey in a way that really sinks into people's thinking. But I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm fairly, I don't know. I feel like we have a lot of pretty good information as best as we can know it. Every model that those guys produce, and I've produced a few over the years, uncertainty baked into it, like assumptions that you have to, and choices that you have to make. There's no way to avoid doing that. And I'm certainly happy to say that like any particular forecast is predicated on a certain set of assumptions and choices. And if you think all those assumptions and choices are wrong, then maybe the forecast is wrong and it should be a different number. I don't know. But again, with those caveats made, I guess the question I would ask is like, again, it's a compared to what question? In the absence of having polling, or in the absence of having quantitative forecasts of elections that use that polling data, what are we going to have? Is it going to be better or worse? I didn't think it'd be worse on balance. At least if what we're interested in is a product that conveys the odds of an election to a bunch of paying news consumers who desperately want to know that information.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a market demand for it. So it seems crazy.
Yeah.
So, you got to produce it.
Yeah.
So how are you going to produce it in a way that's the least wrong?
Right. And I think that also then leads to other kinds of incentives, like the chart of the red dots and the blue dots trying to articulate probabilities there. Some of that also feels like sort of trends in journalism driving the decision about how to try to communicate something. So data visualizations have been big, for 15 years. And especially if you can make them interactive or animated or whatever, then they're cool. They're fun to play with. There's a lot of engagement on it. Are they conveying the uncertainty? I don't know. I haven't, it would be interesting to do like a usability test on some of those things and see what people take from them. But, I also go back to there's an old now CIA paper about conveying probabilities. And it's basically like certain, unlikely, and then a range of probables in between. And everything between 40% and 60% is about even chances. And I keep going back to it going, maybe we should just not make any of these charts and not do any numbers and just say it's certain, it's unlikely, and it's about even chances. And then maybe you can say it's more likely than not, less likely than not, and let people do what they want with it. But that gets me to this question, which I keep trying to kind of, I don't know, almost 5 whys it to try to figure out what the heck's going on. But I find it fascinating that this is a thing we want to know. Why do we want to know 30 days, 60 days, 180 days out from an election, how it's going to turn out? Why is it not good enough to go cast your ballot and then see what happens? Buy the ticket, take the ride.
That's a great question. I think it's based on a very normal and very human impulse, which is presuming you have some degree of interest in politics, you care to some extent about who wins elections. You really want to know, like, what's the chance that my candidate's going to win or the other candidate's going to win? People care a lot because, to be clear, like, it has pretty significant implications for the governance of the country, because Democrats and Republicans are going to do different things.
Right.
So that to me is the most basic answer. I guess if we had no scientific tools, to measure the views of the electorate, maybe we wouldn't care as much because we wouldn't even think it was possible in some sort of like some hypothetical world where George Gallup and Elmo Roper never walked the earth. But I feel like, given that we've had these tools, since the 1930s and 40s, you can't expect people not to use them. So you can't expect people not to care about what the tools are telling them, because they do care about the outcome. And in a sense, like, that's good, because we want people, the other side of the coin is we want people to care about politics. We want people to be invested in politics. We don't want them to be like apathetic. Like, that's the civics textbook version of what citizenship is supposed to be. So, I think sometimes we're a little ambivalent about what that actually means in practice, because we want people to care, but not to care in the way of following the polls or refreshing the 538 forecast or what. So I do think there's a middle ground here that again, it takes discipline to get to it, and probably would take some more education to make sure that more people in the public felt about it this way. But in the talks that I've been giving this cycle, I've just said, look, hey, you don't have to check in every day.
Right. Yes, there are things you do with your life. It does feel like a bell that cannot be unrung. And I think that's an interesting point, that once you get out of, straw poll literary digest, we're simultaneously asking you, whether you're going to vote for, Dewey or Truman, but we're also going to ask you to subscribe and send us some money. Once you get into more scientific methods of survey research, then it does seem like, well, we have the tools that seem to point to the possibility that we would know ahead of time what's going to happen, and that's kind of exciting. And hey, if you've got a Polymarket wallet set up, you can play some bets on it. You can play some bets with your friends. I think there are people who engage with politics the way they engage with sports. There's a lot of overlap there. A lot of baseball guys are into politics stats as well. And I kind of recently made the crack on an episode of this that I think the forecasts belong on the sports pages and the averages belong in the political section, and then they will be rightly situated where they belong, which is half of. I'm half kidding about that. I think the risk obviously is the concern people have about not just the sort of. I think some people look at them, and I think this was true in 2016, and then potentially had some other effects as well. And I think I'm seeing it certainly in my friends who follow these things without being, pollsters themselves, is a kind of, how stressed out and worried do I need to be? Can I just think my candidate is going to win and so I don't have to worry about this? Or do I have to worry about it because it's a nail biter and it might go the other way? And there are things that would happen as a result that I don't like. And so I need to be sure to vote. I need to send money to a candidate. I need to volunteer for a campaign. Or I just need to be like more actually biting my nails over this thing and just more emotionally invested. The flip side of that is the concern that some people had coming out of 2016. I've seen conflicting sort of studies about this, but the extent to which extremely certain expressions in a forecast made some people feel like it's in the bag. I don't need to vote. And you had similar things going on with like the UK election this year, of the probabilities of Labour winning were so high and had been so high for so long that I have in-laws who didn't bother to vote because they didn't feel like there was a point. But the effect on behavior is something that I'm quite interested in. I sort of get why people want to know so much. I think I felt like I understood it more before I started this project, actually. And the more I talk to pollsters and look at polls and talk to political scientists, the less I care about the forecast and the more interested I am in the polling. But is that a concern for you? Do you see evidence of the polls and forecasts actually influencing people's either vote choice or just voter behavior?
Yeah, I know some of those studies. I mean, I think there's suggestive evidence that maybe it matters at the margins. But I don't know that we have conclusive evidence one way or the other, particularly as it applies to the actual choices real voters made in 2016 or any other cycle. So I think probably part of the public education, right, and I think we're seeing that this year, by the way. People are, again, the smart people are good at this. They say, this is a forecast. Right? The forecast is based on these data. If the data are wrong, like if they're systematically overestimating or underestimating Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, then this is what we would get, right? And so you'll see the graphs. The New York Times does these, for example. Like if we had this kind of polling error, this is what our polls, if we had this kind of polling error. So, in my mind, if you're an ordinary consumer of these things, the best attitude is, again, even more radical, kind of uncertainty about what these forecasts can tell us. I mean, really, if you want to be very nerdy about it, the only way to really evaluate these forecasts is to have hundreds and hundreds of election outcomes that they've forecasted, and to say, if they said there was a 75% chance of candidate winning, on average, did candidates who had a 75% chance win 75% of the time?
Right.
That's called a well-calibrated forecast. And so really, what forecasts are doing, if they're successful, is they're just well-calibrated.
Right.
But that's not what people want. They don't want to wait 100 years to know that all the forecasts, that Nate Silver's grandson, carrying on the tradition is still producing
Right.
a well-calibrated forecast. It's
There
more
was that
that,
piece recently that was basically arguing we'll know if the forecasts were right in either 33 years or 100 years or something
yeah,
like
I
that. It was
mean,
great.
so,
Yeah.
and I don't know the right number,
Yeah.
what's the
Yeah.
exact time.
Yeah.
It depends on what we're trying to measure
Sure.
forecast against in terms
Yes.
of knowing. But I would do say, like, when calibration is the goal, that's different than what the average news consumer, and it would
Mm-hmm.
include me, wants from the forecast. And so that's always going to be some tension. And so I think if the best forecasters, and that basically includes the major ones in the American presidential cycles,
Mm-hmm.
if they're communicating to the average person, our forecast is contingent upon, right, the quality of the data, and if the data are wrong or the polls are wrong, then this is the likely consequence. And then
Mm-hmm.
then you can sort of, like, you should be adjusting your own thinking.
Right.
I mean, I think for the most part, back to your question a minute ago, what does that tell the average person about voting and the like? It tells me that, like, assuming a toss up, as opposed to assuming, no, my candidate really has the edge and my candidate's really going to win. It's better to assume the toss up and then go vote,
Mm-hmm.
and do other things that you want to do in politics.
Right.
I don't think, no one should be making decisions about whether they choose to participate in politics on the basis of who's going to win or lose,
Right.
based on some forecasting model.
Yeah.
So that's how I advise people to think about it. And I do feel like the information is there if you go and find it and read it, and it's not hidden from you. Like, I get emails in my inbox where Nate Cohn tells me this is what would happen if we had a polling error of this magnitude,
Right.
based on what our surveys show. So it's there. It's just a question of being able to use that information and adjust your thinking accordingly.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, and now I wish I'd set aside more time for it instead of dragging you down into my musings on certainty. But the other parts of these surveys, beyond the top line number of who you're going to vote for, are questions around issues and policy preferences and sort of general political alignments. And I know that you have, in particular for the last two presidential elections, looked at some of these kinds of questions of what is it really that people are voting on when they vote? Like, what is driving their choices? And there was a paper that you had looked at. I want to say this was back in, I can quickly look, I think it might have been back in May or something. Yeah, it was in May. A paper from 2020 about the role of subjective issue importance in vote decisions, which I thought was fascinating, because it was also sort of saying, like, it's a weak link between what people say are their most important issues and then their candidate choice. And yet we ask these questions anyway. I will also confess, qualitative researcher here, when I see a battery of issues that are single word that could contain universes of meaning within them, I'm not really sure what's getting measured when someone says that abortion is their top issue and what they mean is they want to ban it, versus abortion is my top issue and what I mean is I want it to be, Roe v. Wade essentially restored. Same with immigration. Like, which version of the crisis are you concerned about? Is it, are you voting on immigration because you want more of it? Are you voting on immigration because you want less of it? I don't know, based on that battery of questions. But I also think, I was before I had completed my first cup of coffee this morning, musing about, I wonder if you just segmented the electorate on, do you believe that Donald Trump won or lost in 2020? And if you're on the actually he won side, then maybe that tells me more about your political behavior and your preferences than if you are pretty sure he didn't win. And I was obviously thinking about that in the context of the debate the other night. But I'm curious what you think about these instruments that we have for trying to figure out why people vote the way they do in these big national polls that are not done by folks like you necessarily.
Yeah, it's a really difficult challenge, and it's grounded in the fact that subjectively we are not good at reporting on the reasons for our choices, just generally. In part because the reasons of our choices are not always actually very accessible to us. They can be buried in our subconscious in ways that are difficult for us to kind of, like, sort of call to mind or excavate from down there. So the subjective answers that people give about what's important to their choice, or will they make a choice for this reason or that reason, really aren't necessarily very predictive. One way that we know that, which is what I was writing about, is a study that said, okay, if you said this issue was important to you, is the correlation between your view on that issue and your vote stronger than if you said the issue wasn't important to you? Mm-hmm. And the answer is not really. So we can't use the subjective measure to identify the people for whom the correlation between my view on abortion and my vote was stronger or not stronger. There are other folks who argue that we can use other kinds of measurement techniques to identify a bit more readily, like what people actually care about, like what they actually prioritize. But those are not techniques that are widely adopted in ordinary surveys, just because this is a pretty new type of research. I mean, what we're left with, if you're just looking at ordinary surveys, is, correlations. Let's say, what's your, am I pro-life or pro-choice, and am I going to vote for Harris or Trump? Those kinds of things. Do I think 2020 was won by Joe Biden or not? And if you're just looking for, like, I just want some simple predictor, like that tells me ahead of time. I mean, the how who won the 2020 election is probably not a bad one. What you really want to know is what was the actual psychology of people's choice. These correlations are a starting point, but I mean, the old correlation is not causation thing holds here as much as it does anywhere else. So I think we are at best, you can say, the more convincing thing you can say is if you compared this election to the last election, you're looking for, like, are there particular correlations that have gotten stronger? And that might tell you, if the correlations on those questions got stronger, but the correlations for other questions didn't, then this election, the choices were more about those issues where the correlations got stronger. That's a comparative thing. So the example from my own work, looking at, let's say, the 2016 election, was we could show that people's views of race and immigration were a stronger predictor of your choice in 2016 than it was in 2012 when Obama ran against Romney. And that wasn't true for other things like abortion or other issues didn't become more strongly related. And so we wrote a book that said a distinctive factor in 2016 was race and immigration. And then people said, well, are you saying that that's the only reason people voted for Trump? And it's like, no, like, it's not, there's no tool that we have in any question, whether it's politics or economics, marketing, anything, that's going to say, for that person, that was the one reason why they did that. Like, there's no way to know. So, that's the difference between saying that your view of race was distinctively correlated with your choice, Trump versus Clinton. It's not the same thing as saying every Trump voter is a racist. Right. Or every Clinton voter is a woke progressive. Right. Like, but people don't always think about these correlations correctly. And admittedly, it's an imperfect answer to the original question, which is, why do people make the choices that they do? And there's I think in elections, there's no way to say. Right. And there's no way we're going to know. We can extract meaning from these patterns as characterizations of maybe electorates or of elections, but I don't think we can drill down and talk about individual people's choices very easily. And certainly I would never use those general patterns to make attributions in terms of people's overriding motives or to suggest that their choices came down to only one thing as opposed to a multitude of things. It's very hard to know. Right.
So I guess my last question for you is if you could add, 3 dream questions to the New York Times Santa poll or something like that, what would you want to ask of the electorate? What are you most curious about? And not necessarily for the purposes of predicting the outcome, but just for a better understanding of voters.
I would say, for me, the answers, it's not about the questions I would ask. I guess it's about the type of data that I would love to to
Mm.
collect,
Mm-hmm.
and some of these data are collected, but a really amazing data set would be, a survey that would have interviewed thousands and thousands of people in 2020 and would know whether they voted or not because
Mm-hmm.
of information on the voter file. And then you go back and you'd re-interview those people in addition to new voters and people who
Mm.
did, people who didn't vote, people who couldn't vote but now can vote. Like, you'd redo that analysis, and you'd have a lot of people you talked to before, and people that some new people that you didn't talk to before. And so you'd have the ability to know, for people who are in both years, 2020, 2024, like, how are they changing?
Mm-hmm.
Are they voting or not voting? Are they voting for the same party or not the same party? And then for new voters, you'd be able to see kind of where they landed. And that would really help you understand a bunch of important questions. One of which would be, is the difference between 24 and 2020 because of changes in turnout or changes in like how people actually voted Democrat or Republican?
Mm-hmm.
Seemingly a pretty basic question, very hard to answer. And so and it's especially hard to do this kind of study with like a large sample size, and
Right.
it's hard to recontact people and get them to take surveys 4 years apart. And
Right.
so there are data sets that like chip away at different parts of that challenge, but it's rare to really construct a data set that would do all of those things and do them well. That really would be my ideal data set. And then I think we could learn a lot.
Yeah.
It wouldn't necessarily tell us the answer to why people voted the way they did, but we would get a better answer to, certain parts of why the election turned out the way that it did, why the winner won. So I would love to, if a very wealthy person, wanted to, I guess, waste their money on political science research as opposed to like actually addressing important problems and causes and the world, that's what I would spend the money on doing.
Yeah. Well, maybe a very wealthy person who cares about democracy and sees that as a big
perhaps
problem.
Maybe there's someone out there that's willing to do that. But yeah, I think I think if I were to say it in a nutshell, I think that in politics, the quality of data journalism and political analysis in some ways has gotten a lot better, because I think there's just a lot of smart people doing really good work. The quality of the data lags behind, in part because it's complicated and expensive, I think, to gather the kinds of data that would be, the most useful or the most diagnostic for the questions that people have.
Yeah.
And that's not an easy problem to solve.
Yeah, I'm trying to find someone. Well, I have found someone now in the UK because of the prevalence of MRP polling this year, where they're dealing with like 20,000 respondent data sets in just the UK. And I'm like, my big question is like, who's funding it? How are you getting the budgets for this? But and maybe it's also they're choosing less expensive sampling methods. I don't know, but
that is a method of, I will use less expensive sampling methods. That's how I got 20,000 people. And I will use statistical techniques, which is the acronym you use there, multi-level regression and post-stratification, or MRP. And I will use statistical techniques to provide an estimate of how I think the election's going to turn out. And that's kind of like doing a forecasting model, in the sense of you make certain choices and assumptions about modeling, and then use that as a forecast. And I think that's potentially a valuable way to do that kind of work. I think what would be really amazing is to have resources invested in data collection that would allow us to tell stories after the fact, as much as try to generate forecasts before the election. And I think there would be a lot to learn from that. And in an ideal world, we would be able to learn before the post-election narrative had completely congealed and sealed everyone off from updating and learning new information.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this. This is really helpful and was a good conversation about certainty and about wanting more data, not less, which I also share. So thank you so much for speaking with me today.
It's a real pleasure. Farrah, thank you for having me.
Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic, production by The Difference Engine, and edited now by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly Substack, also available at crosstabspod.substack.com. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, and give the show a rating or review. I would love to hear from you, and it will help other people find the show. Email me if you have any questions, ideas for episode topics, suggestions for future guests, or want to talk about ways we can work together at farrah@crosstabspodcast.com. See you next time.